Hello and welcome everyone to another reaction video. Today I'm going to be diving into part 2 of Extra History's Benedict Arnold series. This is the second and last part of the series. I posted part 1 last Friday, so if you haven't given that a watch yet, please go ahead and give that a watch before you watch this one. It leaves off with him in Philadelphia right before he really commits the official acts of betraying the Continental cause. So this week, which should deal with pretty much all of his actions in actually betraying the cause. This being a two-part series, it gives me an extra time to do a little bit extra research into the subject matter. It was great to get that extra time, and if anything else, it kind of showed me that the history of this specifically has changed over time, and people's what they believe, what level of a traitor he actually was. Some people believe he was more justified in his cause, and some still believe he was just outright evil traitor. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, so I'm kind of excited to see where Extra History falls in that scale as well. But without delaying any further, let's go ahead and jump right into it.
The men meet before dark on a hilltop house of a loyalist spy, a place later known as Treason Hill. On one side, Major John Andre, Chief of Intelligence of British General Henry Clinton. He has come aboard the HMS Vulture and has rowed ashore in a boat. On the other side, Major General Benedict Arnold, who has agreed to betray the country he helped create. This meeting is a culmination of 18 months of correspondence, sent via secret couriers passing coded messages in invisible ink. Messages written between the lines of letters from Arnold's wife Peggy, who John Andre had once courted, and now they've made a deal. Arnold will allow the British to take the fort at West Point in New York, and in return, the British will give Arnold £20,000, an absolute fortune. But their meeting...
Since you brought up money here, I wanted to touch on one thing I learned over this past week of extra research. In part 1, he didn't discuss this, and this is something I don't think is really discussed much at all. But part of the reason that Benedict Arnold's in this amount of debt and needed this money this badly is because he actually paid for some of the military supplies and the salaries of some of his men. Not all of them, and he didn't pay for everything that his militia used early in the war or anything like that, but he did pay some because he was wealthy leading up into the war, and this kind of did attribute to some of his debts, and this also really attributed to some of his hatred towards the Continental Congress, because he did try to get reimbursed for this, and of course he's trying to also get his salary at this time, but like you did discuss in part 1, the Continental Congress did their own balancing of the books, and they found that they didn't owe him money, he actually owed them money. And part of the reason is because Benedict Arnold wasn't the best at bookkeeping himself and keeping the receipts for things. So part of it's his fault, and part of it definitely is some of the Continental Congress's fault as well.
Is interrupted, and when they come down the hill, they find that the Vulture is gone, retreating after being discovered and fired upon, stranding Andre behind enemy lines with evidence of Arnold's treason. Thanks so much to Henson Shaving for helping me get out of hairy situations. In January of 1780, Benedict Arnold went on trial, but not for treason. Nope, this was the court-martial he'd long sought, confident he'd be cleared of all of the charges leveled by old enemies and the civil authorities of Philadelphia. That he was corrupt, that he abused power, and favored loyalists. He conducted his own defense, of course, laced with righteous indignation, tirades against his persecutors, and calls to remember his heroic deeds. It was possibly the greatest display of hypocrisy in American history, and that is saying something in the year 2024. I digress.
By him saying that, I can kind of see where he falls in the spectrum of belief of where Benedict Arnold lies on, the scale of being a horrible traitor, bad person, or some of it being circumstantial and him maybe not being as bad as portrayed. And like I said in the intro, I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I do believe he had a lot of really bad characteristics. He was hated by a lot of people, and he seemed to cause trouble wherever he went. But some of the things, like I just said about the money and him paying for some of his soldiers, some of that stuff seems to always be omitted from the fact that he really isn't just all bad, and he didn't do all bad. He did a lot of great things for the Continental cause that are overlooked because of his final actions. But I think he had a lot of legs to stand on in terms of arguments to make that he's not fully guilty for everything and he wasn't the full blame for everything. Not being promoted, he should have been promoted. I think it was just a faulty system. Things like that. But they're not really discussed, and he just tends to be looked as just outright evil when he's not fully.
Because for 8 months, Arnold had been corresponding with the British to betray his country. Now, in fairness, he hadn't really given the British anything yet. See, for months, he'd been embroiled in negotiations with John Andre about compensation, because he knew that defecting might land him as an exile in Britain with all of his property lost. He wanted £10,000, and to be indemnified against the loss of his property if he needed to bug out. And John Andre was not sure about that. In fact, Andre wasn't sure Arnold had much value at all. The intelligence Arnold sent him was outdated and vague, containing information on troop strengths and supply depots the British already knew. See,
that's a good point. He didn't really have much of value at this time. He did this to himself in a lot of ways. Like I said earlier, he was not loved by a lot of people, especially other officers that outranked him or were similar rank to him. So they didn't share information with him because they really didn't need to. And why would they if they didn't like the guy,
Arnold wasn't anywhere near Washington's inner circle or privy to his war plans. Plus, correspondence had just dropped off before Arnold's trial, as Andre went to besiege Charleston, and a wave of spy paranoia gripped Philadelphia, making Arnold and Peggy lay low. Yet, with his bluster, Arnold convinced the court to find him innocent of all but 2 minor charges, getting off with a formal published rebuke by Washington that he considered Arnold's actions, quote, imprudent and improper. And it was just as Arnold began to stew over this partial vindication that Congress once again raised the issue of his expenses during the retreat from Quebec. Arnold had been slipshod in tracking his expenditures during that time, it was true. But it was also true that some of the paperwork had been lost during the desperate retreat, that Congress had never responded to Arnold's requests to assign him clerks and paymasters, and that it was not realistic for Congress to expect perfect accounting when he was also running a military campaign. Regardless,
I'm glad he talked about this because, like I said, it's kind of a little bit of fault of both parties. It's a bad system. Everyone's new to this. This is not something that anyone's ever really done before. Some people did fight in the French and Indian War, and Benedict Arnold included, but, pinching pennies in this way and trying to fund a war is not easy, especially when you're a new country that's kind of broke. So they were trying to account for every penny they could, and Benedict Arnold wasn't great at bookkeeping and keeping the receipts of things, but he felt like he, through his actions on the battlefield, had won the trust and the ability to kind of spend the money that he saw fit. And Congress, of course, didn't agree with that. He had a lot of enemies in politics and in higher-ranking officers, so they kind of painted him as this evil guy who was just spending a lot of money, and in some cases he was, but it's not fully and completely his fault. Not trying to paint the guy as this perfect hero or anything, but I'm just trying to drive the point home that it wasn't completely his fault in every way.
Their conclusion was that he owed Congress £1,000, and Arnold responded by resigning as military commander of Philadelphia and appealing to Washington to give him a new command. Seems he wanted West Point. Arnold's old commander from the Quebec expedition, Philip Schuyler, suggested that he might take over there. The fort itself was strategically vital, on a narrow bend in the Hudson River, and whoever held it would control the valley. Really,
in a lot of ways, this kind of was beneath him and his status and things like that. It wouldn't be something he would normally take. It was very important, like I said. It was that bend gave that fort a really great ability to defend the Hudson River, and it was really hard to get past. If you held that fort, you held the Hudson River and the Hudson Valley. And that's important because if the British were to take control of that, they would be able to divide the Continental forces into the colonies into, really. And that would be really crippling to the Continental cause.
Perfect command for a military hero with a leg wound that limited his mobility. Which shows that, despite recent trouble, many in the Continental Army were still rooting for Arnold. Of course, he immediately repaid Schuyler's kindness by turning around and writing Andre about the offer, then started liquidating his assets in Connecticut and transferring cash to London. Kinda sus. Though it's not like Arnold had a lot of choice at this point. Even if he'd changed his mind, the British had so much incriminating correspondence that they could have easily blackmailed him into doing anything they wanted. In July of 1780, Major Andre returned from his deployment to South Carolina to find an unread stack of coded letters describing the plan, and immediately agreed. And within weeks, Arnold was commanding West Point. There, he began systematically sabotaging the defenses, refusing to carry out repairs, and transferring the garrison to other areas. Kinda real sus. Then 2 months later, like we showed you at the beginning of this episode, Arnold and Andre were face to face and trying to figure out how to get Andre back to British lines.
Yeah, Benedict Arnold, he was great at taking opportunities as they were presented. When he was shown West Point, he immediately knew that that would be something that would, be worth money. He saw dollar signs in it, and he knew that he could, sabotage it like this to make it easily, capturable by the British. And he saw the dollar signs of what it could potentially give him if he were to turn it over to the British. So he was very good at taking opportunities like that.
Preferably without needing to burn the incriminating letters and maps of West Point Arnold had just handed him. No problem, Arnold said. I'm a general. I can write passes. All you gotta do is dress in civilian clothes, take this pass here saying you're doing important army work, and you'll get back to the British lines no problem. But traveling in civilian clothes meant that, if caught, he could be hanged as a spy. So imagine how relieved Major Andre was when he was stopped by 3 men, but one of them was wearing the uniform jacket of Britain's Hessian allies. So when the men asked him if he was a British officer, Andre said yes, which was not smart, because it turned out they were Americans. The man wearing the Hessian jacket had stolen it while escaping from a prisoner of war camp. They took him straight to a Continental Army officer. Now, luckily for Andre, due to the pass, that officer got confused and sent him under guard to Arnold at West Point. But then, unluckily for Andre, an officer who was part of Washington's spy ring had heard about all this, caught up, and found the documents. And finally,
they actually found the documents hidden in his boot, so it really wasn't hard for them to find it.
Very unluckily for Andre, he would be convicted of espionage and hanged. When Washington arrived at West Point that morning, scheduled to meet with Arnold for his first inspection of the fort, he immediately became annoyed. Arnold didn't greet.
Yeah, really ironically, Washington was actually scheduled to go see West Point at this time, and it had nothing to do with what was going on. He just, kind of perfect timing for him to be able to unravel this and be there himself.
Him, as protocol demanded, and the state of the fort was deplorable. Arnold hadn't even fixed the rusty chain closing off the river. Arnold's officers didn't know where he was either, telling him that he'd gotten a letter at breakfast, left, and never came back, which was when Washington realized that, Benedict Arnold was really kinda sus. Within hours, Washington learned more than he would have preferred to know. The incriminating documents arrived shortly after, and it was clear that Arnold had defected, running to the HMS Vulture and sailing for New York. Confirmation came within days when Arnold wrote a letter explaining his actions, saying he'd lost faith in the revolution, and that British victory was the best way to end the conflict. He then politely requested that Washington convey Peggy to Philadelphia and then to New York, which he did. Now, had Arnold's treason stopped there, he might have just been infamous, rather than hated. Yet after defecting, Arnold entered the British Army as commander of its loyalist American Legion, and they were happy to have him. Ironically, the British had long appreciated Arnold's skill, and his daring escapades had been lauded by newspapers in London. Part of this was a sober reading of Arnold's skill, but another part was a semi-conscious inflating of his reputation.
They painted him a lot of times as one of the best military leaders of all time, which is kind of far-fetched. He is probably up there, in his abilities of military leadership in the field, but he undoubtedly was one of the best, if not the best, in the Continental Army. So, and like they're saying, of course, they knowingly inflated his reputation because they were beaten by him several times, and by inflating his reputation, it doesn't make it seem so bad that they were defeated by him.
The more Arnold was said to be a genius, the less blame British leaders shouldered for being beaten by him. His first outing was to raid Richmond, Virginia, which he seized without a fight and proceeded to burn, destroying many of its buildings. However, he also liberated enslaved people on the area's plantations, promising them freedom if they joined the British Army. He followed this up with a raid on the port of New London, Connecticut, a place not far from his hometown, where he destroyed large parts of the town. Shortly afterward, he stormed a fort garrisoned by Connecticut militia, where his troops were accused of continuing to fire on and bayonet the garrison after they'd surrendered.
Yeah, and this is the horrible things I was talking about earlier that he did. Like, he was not a perfect guy. He was not a great guy. He was not a horrible guy. But this is the things he did here really cemented his reputation as this terrible guy. And you can't really argue against that. You know, a good person really wouldn't do this. They wouldn't destroy a town that's right down the street from where they grew up. It doesn't matter what cause that you believe in. You just wouldn't do that.
This was his last action of the war. Due to Arnold never actually handing over West Point, he was only paid around £6,000 with an annual pension of $350. After the war, he relocated to London before moving again to Canada, where he got rich off land speculation, but also, somewhat predictably, mired himself in a knot of personal disputes and lawsuits. An old man.
Yeah, if you think about it, you know, he tried to take Canada, and the same people that were there when he did that were still there, you know. So he kind of got run out of Canada. You know, he, of course, moved to London, moved to Canada, and then went back to London for the rest of his life. So people don't really talk about that and think logically, you know, you try to take their land, they're going to want you out of there, and they're not going to really like you that much.
And now, barely able to walk due to gout, he found himself shunned everywhere he went as a dishonorable man. Londoners kept clear socially, and neither the British Army nor the East India Company would employ him. He could never return to America, and died in 1801. Benedict Arnold.
Yeah, there's a myth that he died in his Continental uniform, and that he said that he wished he had never put on another uniform, but there's really no evidence of this, so it's more than likely a myth.
Has few commemorations. A plaque of the commanders of West Point lists his birth date, but no name, and the Saratoga Monument, with 4 niches for the leaders of the American Army, has 1 spot left empty. In fact, the only monument to him is the Boot Monument, a piece of marble carved into the shape of a leg with no words or explanation. A tribute to the American hero who died at Saratoga, and the villain who was born. Ooh, I have not.
I'll go ahead and stop it there. So throughout this video, it seems like I'm kind of really arguing that he's this great guy, and that's not really what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to take the stance more leaning towards that it's not all on him, and that he did do some great things for the Continental cause. I fully recognize that he was this really not pleasant guy, and he ended up doing terrible things. But I think that a lot of the stuff is more circumstantial than is given the credit. You know, I think, like I've said a few times now, it's his bad characteristics, the bad person that he is, paired with unfortunate circumstances, you know, kind of led to him becoming this world famous, notorious traitor. And so it's way more complicated than I think is usually just given the credit for. You know, we're just taught in elementary school that Benedict Arnold's this traitor, and you don't really hear any of the details of it. But I'm really glad I did this series. I learned a lot about Benedict Arnold, and it kind of did change my perspective on it. So I hope I may have changed your perspective on it and maybe influenced you to dive deeper into it yourself. But thank you for watching, and keep an eye out for a video next week. I plan on putting out a reaction video every Friday from here on out.